And that was the comment about the minority being terrorist. And I told him, I said, I don't think it was in your heart to call me a terrorist, but your words matter. And if you've ever been in a situation where you literally are in life and death situations where you could be that guy that got scooped up by ISIS or the Taliban, that is, I don't want to say it kind of triggers you a little bit, but it does. And I've been in those situations. When I was in Afghanistan, I was in very vulnerable positions where I could have been on the news. That struck a chord with me that was very hard.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Alaska State House Representative for Ketchikan, Jeremy Bynum. We discuss his childhood growing up in a devout Pentecostal household, his escape to the Air Force, and his struggles being accepted as a newcomer in Ketchikan. We also talk about the inner drama of the Juneau Capitol, specifically his relationship with my Chief of Staff, Kyle Johansson, who was a previous representative from Ketchikan, and the heated rhetoric around specific attempts to draw from the legislative savings account. We explore in depth a podcast episode from last week where I interviewed Representative Zach Fields of downtown Anchorage, where inappropriate language was used to describe the House minority. Jeremy Bynum, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Andrew.
So you grew up in rural Oregon?
I did grow up in rural Oregon for most of my teenage years.
Where was your childhood?
So I was born in Portland, Oregon, and I have an identical twin brother. And, that's kind of where I had my younger years. I went to elementary school in Portland. And then a little bit later on, my dad had met my stepmother. And once they got married, then we moved to Oklahoma for a few years. And at that kind of
time, junior high?
No. We were still, I think we were 8. My brother and I were 8 when my dad had met my stepmother, Sue. We call her Mom now.
Did your parents get a divorce?
I didn't really know my mother growing up. So our mother had, I don't want to use the word abandoned, but she took off and did her own thing. And I don't really remember her growing up. I think that there was a point maybe when we were less than 2 where we had seen her at one point. Right before we were born and my dad had met her, my mother was pregnant with my half-sister. And then my dad and her got together, and then the twins came along. And then right after we came along, she took off with my half-sister. But obviously, we don't remember that. So kind of an interesting time in our life when all that happened. My dad just took care of me and my brother on our own. And I remember my brother and I, it was just the 3 of us, kind of the 3 amigos. And of course, my brother's my best friend. So we did everything together. And there was a point in our lives where my dad was living kind of this party lifestyle. And I think it was in 1980, we were 5. And he was in a very bad car accident. Like, life-threatening. He was in a coma. He had broke his back. It shattered his life, basically. Lost his business. And my brother and I had to live with family friends for quite a while. And at that point, he'd said, what am I doing with my life? And he turned his life around. He found a different path in life. He found Christianity. And that was kind of our entry into this world of not living in a Christian home to then now being in this very Christian home.
So he became very religious.
I would say, yeah, my dad, it was a Pentecostal church. So, that was very strict religious kind of a lifestyle. And then that was in Portland. Later on, it was even more Pentecostal. That's where he met my stepmom, and she was living in Roseburg with her daughters. And he became, at that time, was trying to figure out what he's going to do with his life. I think we might have been 8 at that time. We were going to be 9 that year.
And you got stepsisters?
It's 3 stepsisters, yeah.
Were they around the same age as you?
So one of them is my sister Terry. She's 9 months older. And then the other 2 are older yet. We then moved to Oklahoma. And my mom, we'll call her mom for the sake of the conversation here. She had family in Oklahoma, and my dad had become a long haul truck driver. And that was kind of like this idea that we'd be able to see dad more, which we never saw dad. Dad was always gone. And so we got uprooted from everything we knew, went across the country and lived in Oklahoma. I don't remember exactly how long.
With a new person in your life.
Oh, yeah. It was like a Brady Bunch immersion.
And your dad became a long haul truck driver and wasn't there anymore.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was, for me, my brother and I, it was quite a shock. Our whole life had changed. And now we basically were growing up with strangers, for the lack of a better word. And then I'll just fast forward from there. And we ultimately, the older gals were kind of just kind of exploring and experiencing their own life of trying to figure out whether or not they wanted to be part of this Christian movement that we're part of. And so my sister and my brother, we went back to live with my stepmom's mother.
So that's like your step grandmother.
Correct. Yeah.
Did your dad and stepmom meet at church?
They did. Yeah.
So your dad had this religious awakening, started going to Pentecostal church all the time, met your stepmom.
And she was in the church in Roseburg. And so they had some kind of revival or something in Portland. And they had friends that said, hey, these two would be great to get together.
What was it like being with your step grandmother?
You know, grandma was very loving, didn't have a lot of money. I mean, she's very fixed income, but took care of us. And we lived with her in a single wide trailer. And, you know,
you and your brother and your stepsister who's 9 months older.
It was the three of us, her, and then her husband, Frank. We called him Grandpa Young and Grandma Young. But we did that. And then Mom came back after they got the things kind of sorted out. But Dad was still truck driving, you know, and gone. We might have been around 12, just turning 12 that year, maybe. And then you're like launching off into teenage, you know, finding, exploring yourself. And Roseburg was that for us. So that's where we were.
Your dad, he was still long haul truck driving. Yeah. So he was there, but not.
Correct. Yeah, he was always gone. You know, I always thought that being a truck driver is, you know, is definitely, it's definitely a trade, but it's a hard one for a family. And, you know, you grew up around trucking and Dad being a truck driver.
Did you and your brother have any resentment about sort of being thrust into someone else's family and your dad not being there?
Yeah, I think so. Looking back, I mean, I always had my brother. So no matter what, we had each other. And so it probably wasn't as bad as it could have been if we were twins.
Did you two go to church a lot? I mean, like, was this like
mandatory?
Mandatory.
And when I talk about, you know, the church when we went from there, when we went to Oklahoma, that was like wild UPC type stuff. I mean, they were apostolic, Pentecostal, anything that you can imagine that you've seen in the movies. It was that and more.
Tongues.
Speaking in tongues, running the aisles, everything short of, you know, holding rattlesnakes.
No rattlesnakes.
No rattlesnakes. Thank God.
But people falling down and
all of that. And they're very strict with how you presented yourself. So women, you couldn't cut their hair. Mm-hmm. You couldn't wear shorts. Like for us as boys, we had to wear long pants, long sleeve shirts, like short sleeves above the elbow. That really wasn't something that we were really allowed to do. And the girls, same thing. Long dresses, long sleeves, long hair, no makeup, no jewelry, no TV in the house.
And did y'all become part of that tradition early enough that it seemed normal? Or did you and your brother think, what are we doing?
I would say that I always had some level of skepticism in me, but you know, a lot of times you didn't want to disrespect the people around you, but yeah, it was kind of this idea of like, what the hell is this?
So you guys graduated from high school in Roseburg?
Yeah.
How long before you joined the Air Force?
I couldn't get out of town fast enough. I mean, you got to remember that was at the time when Roseburg was
You graduated from high school in 93?
94.
94.
So Roseburg at that time, when we were growing up, was a logging town, and it was hustle bustle, logging, lumber mills, and all the older kids worked at the mill, working good paying jobs. You grew up around that kind of very blue collar lifestyle where even the younger kids had cars. And so we always thought that, you're going to get a good paid job at the mill. But then that was about the time that the mills and everything started to be under real pressure for federal shutdown. For us growing up, the idea of anything secular was not really looked upon in a positive light. So if I said, I'm going to go to college, the idea of going to college was like, that's too secular and you're not good enough to do that. And so for us, it was like, what the hell are we going to do? And we'd always worked, I'd always had a job from as young as I can remember. I might have been 14 when I got my first job. I always worked even all through. That was kind of an escape to get away from, if possible, you try to work on Sundays so you didn't have to go to church or go to service. Almost every night of the week, there was service in the church. So it was like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, maybe not Saturday, but Sunday, all day Sunday, right? And you always try to work. And my brother did the same thing. And it was just kind of like an escape. And we always thought, like, how the hell are we going to get out of here? What are we going to do with our lives? So my brother and I both joined to go active duty. I always had this old guy used to always tell us, if you're ever going to go in the military, go in the Air Force. Don't ever go in any other service. It's going to treat you the best. And that kind of always stuck with me. So I always thought, I'm going to go in the Air Force. And so we did. Unfortunately, my brother ultimately ended up not going active duty. He ended up going in the Air National Guard. And so he ended up going off to basic training before me and went off and did his basic training and guard. And then I followed after him to go to basic training, go active duty. And that was kind of my escape from this little town.
I mean, I'm sure you talked about it, like why he went guard and you went active duty.
Yeah, I mean, he had his different interests and kind of what he wanted to do. I think the commitment to go and like actually commit to go doing this thing where you're going to now be gone. He wasn't ready to do that, but it worked out for him eventually. And then for me, that meant, going into the military. And I went, and my first assignment was at McClellan Air Force Base. And that was in California near Sacramento. And I was a power production guy. That was my job. That's one of the quickest ways for me to get the hell out of Dodge was they kind of give you the jobs that you're open for, like right now. And Power Pro was one of those. And so I took it and I went off and I was at McClellan Air Force Base at a power plant. It was actually a real power plant at the base. And that was like how I got my first start in power. And so I did that for a couple of years. And then I ultimately went over to Europe, and I was part of the first combat comm over in Europe, stationed in Germany at Ramstein Air Base. And that's where I really got most of my experience of living the world, because I traveled all over Europe.
It's like that. What you're saying is you had your breaks from the hardcore Pentecostal.
Yeah, I pretty much abandoned it, but it's kind of secret. You don't want to go home and tell mom, by the way, I don't believe in doing what we were doing, because they were really still strongly involved in the church. And I still had respect for what they believed. And when I went home, I would behave, but I was always happy to kind of get back to my life.
I don't want to bounce too far ahead, but I mean, is your dad and your stepmom still together?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, they're still married.
Going to church.
They still go to church, but they're not doing, it's like when all the kids leave and then all the grandkids come in, now all of a sudden the standards changed a little bit. And Dad always, for him, his experience in church after that, because he was always gone, was very different than our experience and Mom's experience.
So like years later, when he came back, he was like, oh, you go to church every night?
I'll have to ask him though. Yeah, exactly. Right. And then, it's like now, it's kind of a running joke because we'll go back and we'll visit and we go to the mom's house and there's like a TV in the house. And we're like, what is this one-eyed Satan doing in your house?
You didn't have a TV growing up?
We did not have a TV growing up. I remember it was like when we were 5, my brother and I would go have like cartoon morning, and then he got in church and cartoons were gone. No TV from that point forward. I grew up without a TV in the house.
Did you feel like you grew up in a political environment?
No, I didn't really think about politics growing up. I didn't really think about politics at all until when we moved back to Roseburg. We had a neighbor across the street from us where we lived. And this guy, he worked from home. Me and my brother, we go over and pester him all the time. And he was actually sitting in his lab doing his work, and he listened to Rush Limbaugh. And so my first real exposure to politics was my brother and I harassing him and hearing Rush Limbaugh.
In the early 90s. So that was early Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah, early Rush Limbaugh, yeah. But other than that, political ideology, we really didn't think about much of that growing up. And then once I left and I went off into service, I didn't think about it again
at all.
Right, at all. I knew who the president was and everybody in chain of command, because when you went through basic training, they beat it into your head. You had to know your chain of command. But I didn't really follow politics. And especially being in Europe, you had no consideration who the president was or what was going on. I was interested in being in Europe and traveling and skiing and doing all the kind of cool things there. And then the mission work, that's the time that I'd spent time in Africa. I spent time in Bosnia during the Bosnian conflict, and Kosovo, Albania, all during those wars. I was part of joint forces.
Right. And I do know who the president was, and it was Clinton.
Yes.
And I know because I was deployed to Kosovo, and they have a statue of him. And they have like Clinton Boulevard.
Yeah.
Because for them, he's a hero because he prevented the slaughter.
Right. And William Cullen was his guy back then. I remember because he came to Albania and we got to meet with him when he came and did this little walkthrough, this like little delegation. And then on the plane he went. But yeah, it was kind of fascinating that your grip of politics was only very distant. But we were concerned about the mission and then getting back to Germany, And
you did 6 years?
I did just shy of 6 years. And at that time, I was an E4. I had a line number for E5, that's staff sergeant. And in order to put staff sergeant on at the time...
It's kind of different. E4 in the Army is specialist, and then E5 would be sergeant, and E6 would be staff sergeant. Right?
Yeah.
So...
A little different. But I had my line number. In the Air Force, making rank was a lot harder than in the Army. And so I had done what was called below the zone for my E4. And that was right at the time you probably had heard of buck sergeants. Those were all kind of phased out at that time. But in order to put on staff sergeant, you had to test. And I tested and made staff sergeant early, and I had my line number. And at that point, I'd had this old staff sergeant just said, "What the hell are you doing here? Go to college. Get out of here, go to college." And that kind of stuck in the back of my head. And at that time, that was like BRAC was starting to happen. And they're trying to do all this base realignment and reduction in force. And they basically had said, in order to put on staff sergeant, you have to re-enlist, but you're likely not going to be able to stay overseas. We're going to send you back to the States. So it was like Minot, North Dakota. I'm like, I'm not going to Minot. And that was kind of where the openings were. And I just decided to get out. And so I did. Came home.
And came back to Oregon?
Came back to Oregon. Yeah, I'd come back to Oregon, and I decided that I was looking at what I wanted to do for going to college. And I looked at going to Oregon State. I always wanted to go to Oregon State. But at the time in Oregon, they said, you have to GI Bill. That is your financial aid. You don't qualify for anything else. And so I was like, I don't know if I can afford to go to the university. So I stayed at the community college for a little bit of time. And then I ended up deciding not going to Oregon State. I had gotten a job working for the city of Portland at the Water Bureau, and working in there as kind of like an engineering intern kid in the summer. And so I decided to transfer to Portland State. And that's where I went to school for electrical engineering. So my degree was electrical engineering, and I had a focus in power. My background was in power.
Time in the Air Force,
right? And so I had applied for a job with the Army Corps of Engineers working in their hydropower design center in Portland, Oregon. And ultimately, I got offered an engineering training position, and so I did that. And that was like they're trying to teach you how to be an actual engineer, and that's got my start in power and hydropower. I worked my way all the way up through the organization, everything from a design engineer to basically my final job there is I was what we call a product coordinator, but it's like a program coordinator for all the design work in the South Atlantic Division. So that was Georgia, Alabama, Northern Florida, South Carolina. There's 13 hydro facilities back there that I was responsible for the design work and for the Corps' design centers of expertise. And I did a lot of travel at the East Coast. I was flying a lot. I was gone a lot. And when I got my time off, I was like, I got to do something with my time that's not in travel, not in the town or city. And going through a trade show, there was this little booth at the trade show. And this guy was there and he was pitching this lodge, and it was called Clover Pass Resort in Ketchikan, Alaska. And talked to those guys, and I was like, well, how long can I come stay? They're like, you can stay all summer if you want. And I think the first year I went up with some friends and I stayed for 6 weeks. And then every summer I started staying longer, to the point where I ultimately got an RV. I'd leave the RV there full time, and I would, like, on my free time, I'd fly up there. And I always said, I loved it so much, just getting away and being on a small community. And I always said, if I could find a job here, I'm going to move here in an instant. And I will leave the job that I love. I love the Army Corps of Engineers. I love my work in big hydropower and then all across the nation. And a job opening came open at the utility there. And I said, bye Corps of Engineers and everything I know in the lower 48. And I moved to Ketchikan.
That was 2016?
That was in 2016. Yeah.
So moved to Ketchikan, took a job with the utility. You were single. Had you been?
I'd been previously married.
Okay.
We won't go into
I won't go into that. But I was curious.
We won't go into all of that.
Yeah.
But that's where I met my wife, Carolyn. And I met her on April 7th of 2017.
Okay. So you've been there for a little while, working at your new job. How'd y'all meet?
We were downtown, and I always like to tell the story. Went to the Arctic bar that night with a friend of mine, and it was in April. There's nothing really going on at that time of year. And her and a bunch of her girlfriends came rolling in there, and it was just me and my buddy Matt. And I always tell the story, she like beelined it over, but the real truth of it is probably I kind of followed around like a puppy dog, and she just accepted the fact that she would pay attention to me. So that was April 7th, and then we went out again on the 14th, and we kind of we've been together ever since, really.
I feel like in some ways, like meeting your future wife kind of embedded you in Ketchikan in a way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she lived there for a long time. She's not originally from Ketchikan, so she didn't have family there. But she's a transplant right out of college. So now she must have been there. She must be there now for almost 20 years. So she's really pretty embedded in the community. But even for her, 20 years, you're still just now getting to where you're kind of part of the community. And it's a lot of work to kind of be accepted.
You ran for the assembly in 2020?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
2020.
What got you involved? We talked about how you didn't grow up in a political household. Your time in the military was not particularly political. What brought you?
When I got out of the military, I started paying attention to politics, but I didn't get actively involved. But I was very interested in the process. So what got me really involved was when you live in a small community like that. I worked for a publicly owned utility, and I was constantly engaged with the local government. And although I could not serve on our city government, I could serve on our borough government. And it just felt like that the community is always looking for people to step up And I'm like, I can't complain about it if I'm not willing to do it. So I had ran, I'm trying to think here. So I must have, 2020 is when I was elected, but I ran in 19 and I got beat pretty good because I was only
You'd only been there
three years, And so by that time, that's not long enough to really, everybody needs to look at you. And no matter how involved I was, because I was working at the utility, I was refereeing basketball, very visible in that aspect, and volunteering wherever I could or do whatever I could to be involved in the community. But people were like, no, we're not electing this kid. And then I ran again. And that year I won in 2020. I was just like, I want to be involved. And so I did that. And then eventually I became the director of the electric utility. And so you're super involved there. I'm serving on different boards. I'm on the borough assembly. And then I started traveling the state with like AML and the Southeast Conference. And you go to DC and do advocacy for the borough and paying attention. I'm at almost every city council meeting. And then obviously I'm at every borough meeting because I'm on the borough assembly. And so you just get really entrenched and involved, like what the hell's going on in town and how can I be engaged? And then at that time, somebody said, hey, have you ever thought about running for the House? And I said, no, I really didn't think about doing that, but I'll support anybody that wants to go do it. Then I got to thinking about it. I talked with my wife about it. And that first year I ran against Representative Ortiz.
2022?
That was 22. And then we lost that election, and you learn from losing. You learn from working hard and losing. And my campaigns, I was never like, my idea wasn't Dan's a bad guy. Rep Ortiz I like Dan. It was always about, could I be more energetic? Could I see things differently than him? I have a vision for what I want to try to accomplish for Alaska.
Had you always been a registered Republican?
I had been, for the most part, been a registered Republican. There was a time that I had been registered as a libertarian, but for the most part, I've always been registered Republican, but I never was involved in party politics. Just register.
Back to your races against Ortiz. Only one, because he didn't run the second time.
Yeah.
Well, I guess to go to an uncomfortable place before we shift topics completely, my chief of staff is the former representative from Ketchikan.
Yes.
Former Republican representative from Ketchikan. And he supported Dan Ortiz, who was an independent, against you in the 2022 race. Mm-hmm. And when I hired him, it was actually some awkwardness between us just because it had been a rough campaign and he had supported his guy. And
yeah, it's interesting because when I ran against Dan, Kyle was a staunch supporter for Ortiz, and he was relentless. Kyle was relentless. And I think that Kyle probably saw me as this outsider, that he probably saw me as this kind of MAGA Republican type person. And he was pretty tough on me. And that was hard. But it was even more hard for my wife because, and a lot of people that knew me in town, because they're like, the way, how he portrayed me, and a lot of like his, his social media and some of his things that he would do, like these little memes and these little videos. And, they were actually very entertaining and funny until it's happening to you. Right. So it was tough. And then once I finally got here and then he came here to work here, it was hard to kind of figure out, how do we have a relationship? But I think now I've got to know him and he's gotten to know me, and I have a level of respect for his knowledge and where his heart was. It didn't feel good at the time. I don't know how he feels about it, but we have I would say we have a fairly good relationship, and hopefully it's mutually respect.
Oh, he likes you.
Yeah.
I'll say that.
Yeah. So, but I think it was about trying to learn that my heart is about trying to do his best for not just the community, but the people around me. And I don't think he saw me as an outsider. And Ketchikan can be that way. Outsiders are tough. I, kind of a quick story is that when I first got there, I had went to a board meeting and they had a dinner afterwards for the Southeast Alaska Power Agency. And one of the guys on the board, old time Ketchikan guy, I mean, like entrenched. And the first time I met him, the first words that came out of his mouth, he looked at me, he shook my hand, and he said, "You're just a goddamn carpetbagger." And that was the end of our conversation. It took me 2 years to finally get on this guy's proper side. There's a lot of that kind of like that idea of being an outsider in a small community. So I think that probably some of that is where Kyle was coming from. And probably thought I was a threat to
Ortez.
A threat to Ortez, but a threat to this idea that Ortez stood for.
I feel like that's a good jumping off point for talking about the last week in the House. Because I think I don't want to speak for Kyle.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that what he would say about the whole campaign was like, it was all politics.
Yeah.
It was like, that's just politics. And I think there's been a lot of drama about the supplemental budget. There were some vetoes from Governor Dunleavy, including one that vetoed 2/3 of the DOT budget, which had been portrayed to me as meaning we're not meeting the match and we're going to lose $670 million in federal funding or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that has caused me a lot of consternation because why would we not want $670 million of federal money? I don't care what your politics are or what sort of leverage you're trying to manipulate. We need $670 million for the construction season in Alaska. So we do whatever it takes. But what I've learned, particularly in the last 24 hours, is that there was a lot of exaggerated rhetoric on both sides about this emergency that we have in front of us. Mm-hmm. And I'm very angry because my office doesn't work on road construction.
Right.
That's not my wheelhouse. So I kind of sit back and wait for others to inform me what to do. That was a really bad position for me to be in because I was in a position where when people say that this is the biggest disaster in Alaska state history, I take them at their word. Yeah. And so anyway, we had the supplemental budget on the floor last week. It had passed the Senate unanimously and the legislative savings account, the CBR vote had passed unanimously. And then it reached the House and we passed the supplemental bill unanimously. But then the CBR fell along caucus lines, meaning that we weren't going to draw from the savings account because we needed 30 votes and we only got 22 votes.
Yeah.
Correct.
So, it's really interesting for me because the idea of, I'd heard some rhetoric out there that's basically said the minority is just falling in the groupthink.
Well, and this is all, I'm just going to speak very bluntly. A podcast that I had with Representative Zach Fields that was recorded and released on Friday said that the minority there are good people there, but they're engaging in groupthink. It's sort of like mob mentality that is causing them to make the worst decision in state history.
Sure. Yeah. So, for me, it was really challenging to listen to. And as you know, there's been times here in this legislature last year and this year where I've not voted along caucus lines with my caucus. I've, voted differently and for varying reasons. And some of my other members have done the same. I will say that from a minority position, sometimes you have the luxury of just saying, I'm going to vote how I feel like I need to vote. Being in the majority is a bit of a different situation. The majority has the power of being able to control what actually comes in front of the body. And so if there's something super objectionable, you guys aren't going to agree on, the item just isn't going to come forward. But In the minority, you don't get that privilege. You have to take what comes in front of you, whether you agree with it or not, and you got to push a red button or a green button. Doesn't matter if it's a gray issue. So you got to kind of just align with where you're at. There's some of that idea of that you're on a team. You've committed to this idea of being on this team. And so it's pretty difficult position to be in when you say, I'm not going to go with my team. And, I try to think through all of those things very methodically and try to do what I think primarily, what do I think is the right thing to do in this moment? That's mostly what drives everything that I'm going to do when I go to push that button is like, what is the right thing to do? What is the moral thing for me to do in this? And so I think that I've demonstrated over the last year and a half that I'm willing to make sometimes hard decisions, and that includes overriding a governor. And not only overriding a governor, trying to get people to come along with me because I think it's the right thing to do. And we've been successful with that. So the supplemental vote, when we talk about it, if you back up before the Iran war kicked off, that came in front of the body before we sent it to the Senate. And I was one of the 3 members that voted for the supplemental, and I voted for this CBR draw. And that was a hard vote to take with my team voting the other way. Fast forward to this week, and we have this supplemental came back from the Senate. And they had made a significant change in that CBR language for the supplemental about how we were going to pull from savings. And of course, the world has changed. And, I looked at that pretty methodically. And I think that there's been a lot of conversation, like you said, a lot of discussion about like, what does this vote actually mean? And for me, this time was a little different. And this supplemental budget, when it came back to us with the way the CBR was structured, didn't say, well, if we have a deficit position, then we'll go ahead and cover that deficit. What it said is we were going to pull from savings right away. We were going to just put that into the general fund. And when you go back and look at HB 53, the way it was structured, that if we have a surplus scenario, it doesn't go back to the CBR like a lot of people were claiming. It waterfalls into the statutory reserve, which is just you can just access it. So it was like you're taking money out of the constitutional budget reserve to put in a statutory budget reserve, and it would just be available for spending this year and next year. And when we have potential revenue in forecast that says it's going to be available and we don't need to draw for savings, I don't think we should be drawing from savings. And so that's why when it came time to vote, I was like, I'll absolutely vote for the supplemental. 100% we're going to support Meet the Match, Meet Disaster Relief, Fire, all that stuff. I voted yes for all that. That was my perspective. And the failure of the CBR vote didn't take away what I believe was to support those things.
Well, I'll say too much.
Yeah.
Because I said it to one of your members today on the floor, where basically this person and I had sort of a come to Jesus moment where it was like, yeah, all this rhetoric is completely over the top and crazy. And this wasn't the end of the world. And what I said to this person was, if I were in your shoes, I would be playing these cards exactly the same way as you. Because ultimately, what we were asking is like, we want the CVR drawn now. We want all that money so that if oil prices are up, we have this excess money. We can spend a lot of money. We have a lot of headroom. We have a lot of money to spare. And I want to be able to fund things and to fund things adequately and to fund things better than they've been funded till now. And the way our side was playing it was setting us up to have that freedom, to have that extra money. I mean, that's just me being honest. The rhetoric that you hear is like, oh, we're the fiscal conservatives. You know, we don't know. Oil prices could actually be much lower than they are. Hey, man, they're not going to be lower. They're not going to be lower. Have you watched the news? Yeah. And people are like, oh, but you don't know. They could go crashing down. We saw what happened with Ukraine. Ukraine didn't have the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
This is a different situation. And the fact that people are dying and Alaska's happy because we have higher oil prices, it's absolute cognitive dissonance. It makes me insane.
The hard thing for me is from my technical training and being an engineer in hydropower, everything that I look at from a professional perspective is always trying to look at the long-term durability of where we're going. The one thing that's been really challenging for me here is that a lot of times everything gets compressed down onto this. We're looking at this like right now moment, like just what you described, this idea that we have available money now, we need to spend this money. And I'm like, I'm just like, my mind is blown that when we go to set our budget, we are actually looking at a futures market for where oil might be. And that's how we set our budget. Instead of saying, let's look at a trailing average for the last 5 years. We're going to set our revenue prediction at this level. We're not going to spend above that. And if we do get more money, then we're going to take that money and we're going to set it aside, because the following year or the year after, it's going to have this volatility. When you go look at it, we have volatility. So let's create these smoothing mechanisms looking forward at how we can be consistent on how we spend money.
I said it when the Iran war first started. I said it to our caucus that what kills me is that we really were coming to that moment of talking about the fact that we need revenue measures in our state, that we need more reliable, sustainable, consistent funding sources for state government. And then with the Iran war, it's like all that conversation's out the window. No one's going to talk about the governor's sales tax. No one's going to talk about a potential income tax. No one's going to talk about any of that because, hey, we got tons of money. It's all good. And so we just kick that can down to another governor, another year. And that's unfortunate, because I did think about it on the floor today when we had these hours of speeches about oil prices are up. We don't need to use our savings account. Was like, oh my gosh, could you imagine a time when we had a broad-based tax and we had sustainable income and we just funded our government. We didn't have to have this hand-wringing of like, should we spend this potential oil income? You know, like, I just wish that we could just be like a normal state, just like every other state in the union, and not have this enormous crisis. Right now, a crisis of oil prices are up.
Yeah. You know, part of the thing that, you know, I gave my special order today, like basically how we treat each other matters. What you say matters, right? And it's not just in this building. It's like when you go out of here. And I've always been trying to be really careful when I get on social media that I'm not going to bash you and say, oh, he's a tax and spend Democrat.
Hey, I always say that as a joke because my entire caucus says, we're the fiscally conservative caucus. And I'm like, what if I don't want to be fiscally conservative?
Yeah. And that's okay. And I've never like thought that I need to go out and make my case by bashing on you or any of my other colleagues. We can definitely disagree with the idea of saying, I definitely don't want to tax and just spend a bunch of money. I will consider revenue measures when they're appropriate and for specific purposes, right? And we can we'll probably find like a right path where we can find what that happy medium is. And one of the, like a good example of that is we have this highly digitized income tax, trying to modernize our income tax. I voted for that, right? We didn't end up getting where we needed to go with it, but I wasn't supporting to do that.
Well, hey,
because Jeremy, I think it was important, you know.
I probably should have said this earlier.
Yeah.
But for the vast majority of listeners, this whole section is so boring because no one cares about the CBR. No one cares about the supplemental, like what that means.
Right.
In fact, I thought I did a really good job of explaining it at my town hall on Saturday morning. But then when we had the full Anchorage delegation, one of my constituents stood up and spoke, and it was clear that I had not explained it very well.
Right. Yeah.
So the point is, though, is that the debate and the rhetoric around this decision in the building involved calling people terrorists. It involved saying worst vote in legislative history.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah.
And I feel guilty for having been a part of that. Again, in my defense, like I said at the beginning, this is not my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
I'm trusting others. And I feel like that it's just learning things the hard way. I can't trust anybody to tell me anything with a straight face and be truthful. I have to go and verify everything myself.
Right. I think that there's just some misunderstanding. Maybe I'll just be like, I mean, being gracious and saying maybe it's just a misunderstanding of what does it mean to have an appropriation versus an obligation versus expenditures or outlays. And what do they mean to us when we talk about this complicated thing of a budget and all the Fonzie funds and the sub accounts and the designated funds and the general fund and the ERA and the CBR and the SR, it's all pretty complicated with all the different funds that we got to deal with. I think there's politics at play, obviously. Yeah, but I also think people are trying to do the best that they can with the information they have. And it's not always going to be the best information because sometimes it feels like this stuff gets rushed right at the very end for whatever reason. And you can probably like look ahead and like, if you really did like an evaluation on like why these things are happening, there's reasons on why they happen. Obviously, I don't think we're going to get into any of that because it's pretty complicated and it's strategy and there's like,
hey, I'll sum it up.
Forward ahead,
It's in the minority's best interest to maintain as much power as possible for as long as possible.
Yeah.
It's in the minority's best interest to keep leverage till the very end if they can. And that's why when I had that conversation with your colleague, I was like, yeah, if we were in your position, we'd be doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Because you don't, and I guess to break that down for listeners, if we do a CBR draw of $370 million now, with oil prices as they are, we'll fully fund the budget for the coming fiscal year without needing to borrow from savings.
And more.
And more.
Yeah. Today, my position is like, I'm in 100% alignment with my caucus because we believe that we don't need a draw on savings. And I would not be taking that position, I can assure you, if I thought there was a slightest chance that it was going to harm Alaskans at all. And I'm not saying that there's people that are trying or not, right? The majority, I don't think, trying to harm anyone, or minority members trying to harm anyone. Some of the rhetoric about whatever, politics. One of the things he said that really truly cut to my heart.
Representative Zach Fields.
Yeah. And that was the comment about the minority being terrorist. And I told him, I said, I don't think it was in your heart to call me a terrorist, but your words matter. And if you've ever been in a situation where you literally are in life and death situations where you could be that guy that got scooped up by ISIS or the Taliban, that is, I don't want to say it kind of triggers you a little bit, but it does. And I've been in those situations. When I was in Afghanistan, I was in very vulnerable positions where I could have been on the news because we were scooped up, and that's just how it was. Very vulnerable. I wasn't just on some base somewhere with walls. I was out with the people in the communities doing the hydropower mission, the Hearts and Minds mission there, and very vulnerable security details where like that, you could have been in the news. And, that struck a chord with me that was very hard.
I'm going to say too much right now. We don't really have a Suzanne Downing of the left.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have sort of a propaganda machine, so to speak. And so sometimes I'm like, well, maybe I have to engage in some other more heated rhetoric to try to balance the other side. But then I inevitably feel terrible about myself. I felt terrible about the interview on Friday because, you're just doing what the minority does, which is push back against the majority and question the decisions and make very logical arguments that the majority is not going to give into because the majority doesn't want to give you any leverage.
Right.
I mean, that's really what it comes down to. That is it in a nutshell. But I don't know. I feel like in 2026, in this particular moment in time in American history, I sometimes feel like that being the calm, cool, rational person gets left on the side.
It's definitely not sexy, and it's not getting the headline. And, but, you know, we pull together, and I think we try to look at like, where are we going to be at in 20 years? And at the end of the day, if we work from that perspective, even if it's not sexy, if it's not like up in the forefront, I think it's what's really going to matter at the end of the day. Because a lot of what we do, as you know, is performative, day to day. It's everybody getting worked up.
It's a performance that most people are not watching. To me, that's the thing that I need to remind myself, and I think others needs to be reminded of as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know,
no, people aren't watching.
People are not watching our special orders. People are not paying attention to the minutia of the drama inside the Capitol.
Yeah.
And
well, they watch it if you share it with them. You know, my Marita special order. Oh my gosh, what an impact back home. Like, I saw Marita this weekend, and she's, oh my God, Jeremy, thank you so much. Like, she was so excited, and people back home were like really excited because I took the time to share something that's actually happening here, and I brought what they're saying here to share with you guys.
Hey,
right?
Tell us the Marita story.
So Marita she's a server at the Landing restaurant, which is like a little cafe part of the Landing Hotel. And she is going to be working there for 33 years. And Marita came to this country. She didn't speak English when she came to Ketchikan. And Terry gave her a job working at the cafe. She's been there now for 33 years, dedicated to service in what she's doing. And it's a life of service. Marita has served every sitting governor that's ever come through Ketchikan. She served every congressman, every senator. She had a relationship with Ted Stevens, you know. Even she told me this little story. I don't think I told this on this floor, but she told me that Governor Dunleavy had come through some years back. And she came up and she says, "So what can I get? Yeah, Governor, you know." And he says, "I want this." And she goes, "You mean please?" And he said, "Yes, Marita, please."
That's
you know,
funny.
because she just has been there. She's like an institution, right? You could probably have her on your podcast and tell her, you know, about her life experience, about how she ended up coming to this country and learning English and just being a mentor to anyone that's in her life. She leads from where she's at, right? She's a leader. I love her.
Well, Jeremy Bynum, thanks so much for being on the show today. Thanks for being so generous with your time.
Well, I had a great time. I don't know how much of it'll make the cut, but I really appreciate you doing it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@ahlug.gov or call 907-465-4940.